So one rook checkmate is basically very similar to the one queen checkmate, where we try to bring the queen closer to the king, and with the help of the king, we support the queen, and in the end, we do the checkmate. Similarly, in the one rook checkmate, we'll do that, where we will try to bring the king and the rook closer to the opponent's king, and we'll try to keep the king in the corner and cut the squares for the opponent's king so that it can move to the corner and we can checkmate the king. Okay. In this, you have to remember a few pointers. That is, the rook and the king will always work together. Okay, so the first is the rook cuts the enemy's king and makes a wall. That is, if I move the rook over here, I will try to reduce the number of squares that the king can move in. As you can see over here, the king cannot come out of the square because the rook is controlling the number of squares over there. Also, the second point is keep the rook far away so it feels safe. So, unless your rook is supported by the king, you need to keep the rook as far as possible from the king. Okay. The second step is you will try to bring closer to the rook each and every step. Okay. Step by step, slowly you will bring the king closer to the rook, and that is how you will checkmate. Fourth, push the enemy king to the side of the board. That is, we will try to bring the king with the support of the rook and the king in the corner so that we can checkmate our opponent. Okay. So, what are the four golden rules? That is, first, the rook cuts the squares of the king. Okay. Second is the king helps. The king supports the rook in each and every move to help and bring the opponent's king to the corner. Third is bringing the king to the edge of the board, right? Fourth is checkmate. Let's see how do we checkmate. First of all, we will bring the king on d4 square. Okay, so that the king, each of them are standing in front of each other, leaving a rank behind. So the king cannot cross these three squares, right? Because the king is already controlling these three squares. So the only option for the black king is to move back. That is to move aside. Now, we'll bring the rook that is on e1 to e6 to reduce the number of squares again for the king. So the king moves behind, trying to attack the rook. Okay, here he can attack the rook, right? Next is we'll bring the support to the rook, as which was the second rule for us, that is, king will help the rook supporting him. Okay, what happens next? The king will go on c7 as it's the only option for him. Second, we'll again try to move the king on c5 in front of each other, leaving a rank in the between so that the king cannot cross these squares. Again, reducing the number of squares for the opponent's king. What next? The king will again come here. Then I'll try to take the rook behind. This was just a behind move so that the extra move is the king can only move this side, trying to come in front of my king. Okay. Now again, the king will be controlling these three squares. So we have again reduced the squares for the opponent's king. Let's see what happens. I have played my rook on e7, that is the white rook on e7. Again, the squares for the king are completely controlled by the king and the rook, as you can see on your screen. Hence, the only option for the king is to move behind. Okay, again reducing the number of squares. Let's see what next I can do. I can bring the king closer to the king in front of him. The option for the king is to move this side because he cannot come here because the rook is controlling this square and the king is controlling here, right? So the king option is to move in the corner. I will bring the king rook closer to the king, trying to reduce more squares for him. Now the king has only these two squares to move, I guess, right? Let's see what happens next. The king has moved on b8. The king has again tried to come here. My king is coming on c6. The opponent's king is going in the corner and it will be trapped. Let's see how we will checkmate him. Again, the rook comes on c8. I will come this side supporting my rook. I cannot go away, right? So the king will again go this side. I will try to reduce the number of squares again for the king, right? Now the king has only these two squares to move because these squares are controlled by the rook. Understood? So now the only move for the black's king was to move the king on a8, right? Now the only corner. What can I play next? The second rule, that is king helps. I'll again try to bring my king closer over here so that I can checkmate the king. Next, only option for the black, king on b8. Next, I'll bring the king in front of the king. Now, you know this is a very dangerous move because there is only one rank left between the kings and the king cannot move anywhere except this square, right? So let's see what will king do. The king will move over here, which is on a8 square. Now, this is a checkmate in one. How will you checkmate? Let's see. The king is controlling these squares. The rook is also controlling this file. What is the move that I can use to checkmate? Obviously this one, right? If I do here, the king cannot come here, here, or here. This is known as a checkmate, right? So in this way, we can completely checkmate our opponent's king with the help of the rook and the king. I hope you understand.